In July 2022, 4 European bison were loaded into crates in Scotland and driven south to a woodland near Canterbury, Kent. It was the first time this species had touched British soil in 6,000 years. What happened in the weeks that followed was not what the conservationists standing at the tree line expected, and it was not what a century of conservation science had prepared them for. Within hours of release, the matriarch, an 18-year-old female, did not graze. She did not explore. She charged into a thicket and began dismantling it. She gouged vertical strips of bark from a willow with her weight and her horns, exposing raw pale wood in long surgical cuts. Beside her, the younger females dropped to the ground and rolled violently, churning soil that had not seen daylight in decades into shallow, open pits. No ranger directed this. No feeding schedule triggered it. These animals, born in captivity, were executing behaviors coded into their biology across 10,000 years. Behaviors that a closed, stagnant woodland had not witnessed since the Stone Age. This is the story of what 4 bison revealed about the hidden death of Britain's ancient forests, the evidence the conservationists themselves admit they were not ready to accept, and the disturbing implication that everything we have called healthy woodland management may have been accelerating a quiet ecological collapse. The project is a partnership between the Kent Wildlife Trust and the Wildwood Trust, with a monitoring program running until 2050. The bison's genetics are traced through the European Bison Pedigree Book, a record maintained without interruption since 1932. The data is not anecdotal. The baseline surveys conducted before the animals arrived documented 178 species of spider in these woods, including a critically rare species not recorded anywhere in Britain since 2004. A rare fungus beetle, absent from UK records since 1988, was clinging on in the undergrowth. Nightingales, lesser spotted woodpeckers. The richness was there, buried, surviving in fragments, but the physical architecture needed to sustain it was collapsing. Walk into a British ancient woodland and it looks healthy. The canopy is dense, the trees are tall, the ground is deep in leaf litter. The phrase itself, ancient woodland, carries the weight of something protected and intact, and for decades, conservation policy has treated these places accordingly, managed lightly, fenced carefully, preserved against disturbance. That is the official story, and it is reasonable. It is the story most ecologists told themselves. But there is one detail that does not fit that story, a detail the baseline surveys at West Bleen made impossible to ignore. Underneath that green canopy, nothing was growing. No shrubs, no flowering plants, no layered understory. The forest floor was empty. Think about that. A woodland described as ecologically significant, harboring rare species, ancient in designation, and its floor was biologically silent. The Kent Wildlife Trust had spent years trying to fix this with conventional tools. Coppicing, cutting, clearing. Results were temporary. Stopped the work for even a season and the canopy resealed. The light vanished again. The ground returned to shadow. What they needed was something that worked continuously, across every acre, in every season, without a budget line. And what they found, standing 900 kilograms, breathing fog into a cold Kent morning, changes everything the conservation establishment assumed about how a forest heals. Now here's what you need to understand about the woodland those bison walked into, because the problem was not obvious, and that is precisely what made it so dangerous. West Bleen and Thorndon Woods had been designated ancient woodland, a classification reserved for sites with continuous woodland cover since before 1600. In Britain, that label carries near sacred weight. It implies ecological continuity, depth, resilience, and standing at the perimeter looking in, you would have no reason to doubt it. The canopy was full. The trees were mature. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood, the way a forest is supposed to smell. But designation is not ecology, and appearance is not a function. Before the bison arrived, the Kent Wildlife Trust commissioned baseline surveys of the site. What those surveys documented was a forest in the late stages of a slow suffocation. The canopy, precisely because it was so dense, so continuous, so unbroken, had sealed out the sun, not partially, comprehensively. Light levels at the forest floor had dropped below the threshold required to sustain flowering plants. The shrub layer had collapsed. The structural complexity that a forest needs to support specialist insects, the dead wood, the open glades, the bare earth, the varied heights, had been smoothed away by decades first of commercial management, then of well-intentioned neglect. What remained was the appearance of health with none of its function, a green shell, impressive from the road, biologically hollow at its core. The trust had not been passive. For years, rangers had worked the site with coppicing cycles, cutting sections back to allow light in, then moving to the next section while the first resealed. It worked locally, temporarily, but the woodland is 560 hectares. The budget was finite. The canopy was not. Every cleared section would begin closing again within a few growing seasons, and the resource required to stay ahead of it was simply not available. Not to any conservation organization, not at any realistic scale. Let that sink in. The only tool that was working required more labor than the entire British conservation sector could sustainably provide. What the woodland needed was something permanent, something that responded to no timetable, required no salary, took no days off, and operated across every corner of the site simultaneously, driven not by a management plan, but by 10,000 years of instinct. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew about nature, hit subscribe. We go deep on the evidence mainstream narratives ignore. Now, back to the mechanism they found, because what this animal does to a forest, and how it does it, is unlike anything conservation science had encountered in the modern era. To understand why these four animals matter, you need to know how close they came to never existing at all. The European bison, the wisent, was once the largest land animal on the continent. It ranged from Britain to the Caucasus, through the great forests of Poland, Germany, and Romania for hundreds of thousands of years. By 1927, every single wild bison on Earth was dead, not threatened, not endangered, gone. The last wild population, living in the Białowieża forest on the Polish-Belarusian border, had been wiped out by a combination of hunting, habitat loss, and the catastrophic disruption of the First World War. When soldiers shot them for food, the species did not decline, it collapsed. And when it was over, what remained of the entire European bison population was 54 animals scattered across zoos in 12 countries, of which only 12 were genetically viable for breeding. 12 animals, that was the entire foundation of everything that exists today. What followed was one of the most methodical and improbable conservation efforts in recorded history. The European Bison Pedigree Book, established in 1932 and maintained without a single gap through 2 world wars, tracked every birth, every death, every genetic pairing across decades. By 2022, the global population had recovered to approximately 7,000 animals. From 12 to 7,000 across 90 years, in the margins of a continent that had already decided they were finished. That is not a recovery, that is a resurrection. But here is what that near extinction cost the species and what it cost the ecosystems waiting for their return. 90 years of absence. 90 years during which the forests of Europe continued to close, to stagnate, to hollow out, without the animal that had structured them for millennia. The bison did not simply disappear from the landscape. Something the landscape depended on disappeared with them. Because they did not just bring back an animal, they brought back a specific set of tools, and what those tools do to a forest, when finally unleashed, is the reason the conservationists at West Blean were standing at the treeline with their clipboards and no idea what they were about to witness. Here is what those tools actually are and how they work. The first is bark stripping. When a bison weighing 900 kilograms drives its horns and the full mass of its skull into a tree trunk, it does not kill the tree. Not immediately. What it creates is a wound, a long, pale vertical scar where the bark has been torn away, exposing the living wood beneath. Foresters call these structures snags, and in a biologically complex woodland, snags are not damaged. They are habitat. Exposed wood is colonized within weeks by specialist insects that bore into the softened surface. Those insects attract woodpeckers. The woodpeckers carve cavities that become nest sites for birds and bats. A single bark-stripped tree, left standing and dying slowly over years, generates more biodiversity value than dozens of intact trees in a sealed canopy. The bison were not destroying the forest. They were building it, just not in any form a tidy-minded conservationist would recognize. The second tool is tree knockdown. Bison will lean their full mass against younger, thinner trees, bending or breaking them entirely. A fallen tree creates something the sealed canopy had eliminated: a gap. Light reaches the ground. Within that gap, a successional cascade begins. Pioneer plants colonize first, then shrubs, then the structural complexity that specialist insects require. One tree knocked down by one animal triggers a process that self-sustains for years. The third tool is wallowing. The shallow pits churned by rolling bison, exposed, compacted bare, are not incidental. Bare earth is one of the scarcest resources in an over-managed British woodland. Certain rare plants cannot germinate through leaf litter. Certain insects cannot nest in covered ground. The wallows create patches of open soil distributed randomly across the site, each one a microhabitat that no management plan would have thought to place exactly there, in exactly that configuration. The fourth tool is selective grazing. Specifically, the bison's preference for bramble, rhododendron, and rank grass over native wildflowers. Every time a bison strips a thicket of invasive rhododendron and leaves a native plant untouched, it is performing a calibration that conservation volunteers spend thousands of hours attempting to replicate by hand. 4 behaviors. Each one generates a different category of ecological value. Each one operates simultaneously across the entire 560 hectares every day without direction. Think about that. No management plan, no budget, no seasonal shutdown, just 4 animals doing what their biology had been refined over millennia to do in a landscape that had spent 90 years waiting for them to return. And the results arrived faster than anyone, including the experts, predicted. If you've made it this far, you're part of an audience that demands real data over comfortable myths. Subscribe and share this with someone who thinks they know what a healthy forest looks like, because what the monitoring data recorded next is the reason this project is now being studied by conservation programs across Europe. The data came back faster than the monitoring program had been designed to process. By the end of 2022, within months of the bison's arrival, ranger surveys at West Blean recorded dung beetle larvae appearing in bison droppings across multiple sites in the enclosure. Dung beetles had been functionally absent from this woodland for years. Their return was not gradual. It was immediate, as if a signal had been broadcast through the soil that something had changed. The project ecologists noted that the speed of colonization suggested the beetles had been present in the surrounding landscape, waiting, held at the boundary of a habitat that had nothing to offer them. The bison provided what was missing in a matter of weeks. The slow worm counts tell a more precise story. In 2021, pre-bison baseline surveys recorded 36 slow worms across the monitored sections of the site. By 2023, that count had risen to 58. Grass snake sightings across the same period quadrupled. These are not charismatic species that attract conservation funding. They are indicators, organisms whose presence or absence signals the structural health of a habitat with a precision that no single survey can replicate. Their recovery at West Blean is documented, physical, and measurable. And it happened not because of a program designed to help them. It happened because the floor of the woodland was, for the first time in decades, doing something. Then the plants began returning. Species not recorded in the monitoring zones for years started appearing in the churned earth around wallow sites and along the corridors opened by tree knockdown. The bare soil the bison had created was not empty. It was a seed bank waiting for light. But here is where the story fractures. Because while the ecological data was accelerating in one direction, the institutional response was moving in another. Under the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, the bison at West Blean cannot be managed as truly free-ranging animals. The site required the construction of what project managers termed bison bridges, elevated crossing structures, and managed corridors to keep the public separated from 900-kilogram animals operating without a fence between them and the footpaths. The engineering is practical. The reasoning is sound. But the infrastructure reveals something deeper. a profound institutional discomfort with the logic of what the bison represent. Because truly effective rewilding, as the data at West Blean demonstrates, requires accepting a landscape that looks, by every aesthetic standard we have cultivated over centuries, broken, scarred trees, churned mud, fallen trunks, open wounds in the canopy. The bison bridges are not just a safety measure. They are a boundary between two entirely different ideas of what nature is for. The conservationists at Kent Wildlife Trust have been careful and considered in how they speak about this tension, but the documented position of the project is unambiguous. According to the Trust's own monitoring reports, the bison are not the beneficiaries of this project. They are the mechanism, and the mechanism works. The question the data forces, the question the bison bridges make impossible to avoid, is whether we are willing to let it. What is happening in Kent is not a return to the past. The past cannot be returned to. It is an experiment in letting go, in accepting that the forest we find beautiful and the forest that is alive may not be the same forest, and that the gap between those two things has been killing our woodlands quietly for a very long time. In September 2022, 2 months after the founding four arrived at West Blean, a calf was born. The first European bison born in a British woodland in thousands of years. It did not arrive into a pristine wilderness. It arrived into a landscape of stripped bark and churned mud and fallen trees and open wounds in the canopy. It arrived into exactly the kind of forest that our conservation aesthetics have spent a century trying to prevent. And it was, by every biological measure available to the monitoring program, the healthiest woodland floor these trees had stood over in living memory. Here is the shape of what we have just seen. A forest declared ancient and protected, dying in silence beneath a sealed canopy. A species hunted to the edge of oblivion, rebuilt from 12 survivors across 90 years of meticulous record-keeping. 4 animals released into 560 hectares, and within months, dung beetles returning from the perimeter. Slow worm populations rose by 60%. Grass snake sightings quadrupling. Plants emerging from a seed bank that had waited decades for light. Rare species not recorded in Britain since 1988, reappearing in the churned earth around a wallow. Not one of these outcomes was engineered. Not one was budgeted for. Every single one was a consequence of allowing something ancient to do what it was built to do. The question is no longer whether rewilding works. The data at West Blean answered that within a single season. The question is what we are willing to let go of, the tidy, managed, aesthetically comfortable version of nature that has been quietly hollowing out our ecosystems for generations in order to have something alive. We have spent a century protecting the appearance of wilderness while eliminating the processes that make wilderness function. The bison did not return to a landscape that was waiting for them. They returned to a landscape that was dying for them. And the distance between those two things is the distance between conservation as we have practiced it and conservation as the evidence now demands it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because the next animal return we're covering goes even deeper into the hidden history of what we have erased from this landscape and what is still waiting to come back. The calf born in that broken, beautiful woodland in September 2022 has no idea what it survived to become, but the forest does.